welcome to One Verse. Tonight we have Todd Hostetler, the pastor at City on a Hill Teaching Center, and Jeff Millslegel, also a Bible teacher at City on a Hill. They are going to have a verse that they do not know ahead of time. And Jeff, you're going to go first, and it is a New Testament verse. And this one is Luke 13:6. And that says, "So ought not this woman, being a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has bound, think of it, for 18 years, be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath?" That's Luke 13:16.
Oh, 16. Okay. Heard you say something different. And I was looking for that.
Only as I could.
Okay. All right. 13:16. Okay. So let me get a quick idea of the text here. Okay. So Jesus is teaching here, and he's been teaching in the synagogues on a Sabbath. So that's always interesting. Invariably, Jesus had so many encounters with people on the Sabbath. And of course, he would end up healing folks on the Sabbath, and that just made people mad, which is just strange to me when you think about that. The Lord doing something on, the day that's supposed to be set aside for him, and that makes people upset. But anyhow, that's kind of what's going on. So a woman comes to him who's had this infirmity, whatever difficulty she's had, and has had this for 18 years. And it mentions here how she's bent over, and there's no way she could raise herself up. I'm going to assume this is some sort of like back problem or something like that. And he lays hands on her in verse 13, and immediately she's straightened out. So now you get to verse 16, and he's of course, the folks have been upset with him. The Pharisees and religious leaders are mad about all this. Oh, in fact, I just saw this in verse 14. They're saying, "Are there not 6 days in which men ought to work? Do your healing when I want you to, Lord. Yeah, don't do it on your day. Do your healing when I want you to." So that's just kind of funny, isn't it? And then you get to verse 16, and here's how he responds to them. This woman is a daughter of Abraham. She's a child of the covenant, guys. Okay, she's a child of the covenant, and Satan has bound her for this long. And you want me to not heal her only because it doesn't fit within your agenda right now? Okay, so this is actually somewhat, at first comical, but then you almost get angry because you realize they were more interested in Jesus kind of conforming to their way of thinking than actually allowing this dear soul to be healed of something. And we don't know how old she was, but good grief, if she's had this thing 18 years, she's got to be, I don't know, she's 40, 50, 60, older. But and yet they're not concerned about the health of this woman, and not rejoicing that she's finally relieved from this, but they're mad because Jesus didn't do it the way, watch this, they wanted him to do it. Folks, it's so easy to get upset at the Pharisees, but how often do we get upset because God's working a work, but it's not the way I wanted it? I don't know. I have found out in my life, God almost never works things out the way I imagine he's going to. He seems like he always has a better plan. But I want to be flexible enough and a servant enough to be willing to accept what he is doing in my life and not just get upset because it's not the exact narrow parameter that I'm giving. These guys were mad at Jesus because he's doing something that's out of the way they want to think of it. They're taking power from them. There's a whole bunch of other personal dynamics going on here. But they're the rulers of the synagogues. They're the guys in control. They couldn't do anything about this dear soul, but Jesus could, and that made them upset. They're upset about their kingdom being stripped away, and they're not rejoicing in this dear lady that's been able to be healed of this infirmity she's had for 18 years, nearly 2 decades. And yet that doesn't make them happy. Look, let's be happy. Let's be thrilled. Even if you don't understand it, it doesn't make any sense to you. Be thrilled when you hear a story about somebody that God has touched in a unique way. You should just be happy about it. It may not line up with everything you like to agree. It doesn't matter. Be happy when God touches somebody this way. All right, Todd, what do you got there for us?
Well, I think it's interesting that as the verse begins and Jesus is speaking and saying all the things that Jeff just elucidated for us. But I think it's interesting that he starts off this verse by saying, ought not this daughter of Abraham? As Jeff said, what he's talking about there is he's referring to the fact that she is part of a covenant. She had a covenant with God. And so Jesus is saying, well, listen, you're trying to set the standards. You're trying to set what should be and what should not be. But she has a covenant, and it's a personal direct covenant that she has with God. It's part of the Abrahamic covenant, but it's a covenant that she has with God. And because of that, she can operate in that covenant and receive. If she has faith, she can receive those things. Who are you to stand between God and this woman and the covenant that God has given her? No, get out of the way and let her operate in that covenant. When you go back to the book of David, one of the things that you really learn about covenant is with David when he's facing Goliath. Because all of Israel had gathered up to fight the Philistines, who were led by Goliath. They lined up for battle, but none of them actually went into battle because they were all too afraid to take on Goliath. But David understood the power of covenant. He understood that he, as a child of God, as an Israelite, had a covenant with God, and he could operate in that covenant, and then he would have, through that covenant with God, victory over anyone, regardless of their size or the situation. He understood a covenant, and he acted in the covenant. And that's what Jesus is talking about here with this woman. She has a covenant, so get out of the way. She has a right. You have no right to judge her for this. Well, here's the thing to really think about that. Jesus was talking about the covenant that that woman had because she was a daughter of Abraham. You and I today have an even greater covenant because of what Jesus did. Jesus said that we have the new covenant in his blood. We have a covenant that is superior to even what this woman had. This woman, Jesus is talking about this woman, the rights that she has because of her covenant. Jesus wants you to realize the rights that you have because of the new covenant in Jesus' blood that you entered into when you accepted Jesus as your Savior. You have a covenant. Realize the covenant means the promise. Realize the promises, the agreement that you have entered into with Jesus. Part of that is to receive the victories that he has for you. What are you needing today? Don't look around to what others are talking about because they're going to try to distract you from the covenant just like these Pharisees did. Instead, know your covenant, stand in your covenant, operate in your covenant, and receive the things that Jesus has for you. Jeff, wrap us up.
All right, there's two little things that happen here. In verse 14, it mentions a ruler of the synagogue was indignant. He responded with indignation. So he's so upset about this going on. Then after they have this little exchange, Jesus says, look at the very end of verse 17. It says, all the multitude rejoiced for the glorious things that were done by him. So you have a choice when God does something. God works in somebody else's life. And maybe it's not exactly the way you think it should work out, but you have a choice. You can be indignant, like the ruler of the synagogue. You can just be mad about it, and that's not the way it should be done, or I think it should be done. And you can get all upset and self-righteous and everything else if you want to. Or you could be like these other folks that are standing around, and they are just rejoicing. They're like, I don't know what the dear lady's name. Let's say her name is Edna. Can you imagine old Edna here? She got healed by this. It was glorious. And they're just happy and they're throwing a party with each other and they're glory. Man, don't you want to be in that camp? Who wants to be around people that are mad and grouchy all the time? I don't want to be around folks like that. I want to be around people like this that are just rejoicing at what God is doing. All right, so that's this edition of One Verse. Thanks so much for joining us. We hope to see you next time right here on One Verse.